I loved the music. I didn't like the schlumpiness of it. And I stand by what I said when speed metal first came out and all that stuff. I said one or two bands will survive, the rest will all die. Metallica survived, maybe one other or something on that level. Certainly Maiden, no question. But they weren't part of that. They were just part of new metal. And I said the same thing about grunge. I said, really like the songwriting. I like Alice in Chains. I like that. But at the end of the day, you're going to get one or two bands, and then the entire thing will die. Sure enough, it's Nirvana and Pearl Jam and nobody else. But the British invasion, 1,000 fucking bands. Motown, 1,000 artists. Because the difference there is that all those musical genres were not, most importantly, was the songcraft, but there was stagecraft. When you heard Temptation songs, you actually went to see them live, and they were on stage putting on a show.
I think there's the sense from fans that the Carnival of Souls record had a fair amount of grunge influence. How accurate is that?
Yeah, that's true. That's true. We
Where did that
liked,
come from?
well, we liked some of the stuff we heard, but was it as honest and authentic as our other stuff? No. It's like going to another country, right? And you love the way East Indians dance. You go, oh, that's cool. And then you get up on the dance floor and you try to do it. Isn't it true that you were, trying to, you're influenced by, sure, can I dance as well as somebody who's been dancing East Indian dances all their lives? No.
Loved it. Soundgarden, Nirvana, Alice in Chains. It's probably a lot of more that I can't think of, but really important music. Temple of the Dog. What a great record Temple of the Dog is. Big moments in music. I've always been drawn to that just because it's exciting.
Yeah.
I love to hear revolution and evolution in rock and roll. So, same deal. Big Alice in Chains fan, big Nirvana fan, Soundgarden. Love those bands, and you've probably heard before, either from me, from other musicians, we feed off each other, we inspire each other, we get ideas from each other, So all of those great moments from the grunge experience, I missed Pearl Jam, didn't I? Pearl Jam. All of those things from the grunge experience live on, and yeah, very, very important and valuable expressions of music from the grunge.
To kind of go along that, what are your memories of Nirvana exploding onto the scene?
Well, we had MTV at the time, didn't we? So I was intrigued, especially the acoustic set. I think Nirvana was just this extraordinary, explosive type of sound and feel and look that attached itself to a whole new, extremely hungry set of ears around the US and the rest of the world. A younger set of fans that was yearning for that type of musical experience.
Yeah.
With the rawness and the honesty of Kurt's lyrics, and just the incredible sound that they made. I never got to see them play live, but Dave Grohl on drums, man, insane. So I think that Nirvana were as important to a specific definition of music fans as the Beatles was, for example, to me. If that makes sense in the equation.
It does.
It was a needed moment. These bands, there are certain bands in the history of rock and roll that are very important and very needed, not just for the bands and the fans, but for the industry as a whole. Radio, every aspect, magazines, media. That band really shook things up in the right way at the right time.
I'm not into labels at all, let alone that one. I think it's a joke. It's all music. They keep coming up with labels. This is, I'll tell you where I learned it, man. As soon as we started playing 8 Miles High, they said, oh, jazz rock. And then we brought in some stuff from Ravi Shankar, and they said, raga rock. And they kept trying to put a label on it. The reason they keep trying to come up with labels is to have something that they can write about that sounds new and groovy, right?
Yeah.
But it's also just so they don't have to think about it. If they can get a label on it, that's a blah blah blah, and I don't have to think, oh, that's one of those. And then they've got it categorized, and you don't have to think about it. I don't think any of those labels matter at all. I have never paid any attention to any of them, and I don't think grunge mattered at all. I don't think it's a real thing. I think it's just people trying to label shit, and it's a joke to me.
That's a good question. I'm not so sure it affected us musically. I mean, I think we're quite subtle about any influences that we might hear outside of our own direction of music, or that's the way we felt. I think there were some moments where we sort of leaned towards that grungy sort of sound or arrangement.
Yeah.
But personally, I loved it. All those Soundgarden, Pearl Jam, I loved those bands, and I thought they were all so good. And I think that we were part of the history of that period. I think there was something in a lot of that music that harkened back to different moments in the life of Rush, and I think we've probably influenced a lot of those musicians. Certainly, a lot of them have mentioned us in their bios. So it's nice to have been a part of it in that way.
I think some fans saw like some, sound creep in on the Counterparts record. Did grunge influence how you approached that album any differently? Did you draw any sort of inspiration in that period, do you think?
Maybe a little subconsciously, but
yeah.
I think more so it was a reaction to the previous couple of records, Roll the Bones and Presto, which, we changed co-producers. Those records in terms of sound were lighter.
Yeah. And
I was never quite comfortable. There are things that I really love about those records, but when I listen to them, I'm glad that Counterparts followed it with a much heavier, more guitar-centric sound and approach. I always thought the guitar is such an important, particularly in a three-piece. However, playing with active players like Eddie and Neil required something else from me, and I had to take on sort of a different role and look at it in a different way to make up for their activity or their active playing.
Yeah.
I think Counterparts was that record where we still combined all those keyboards and all of that stuff that we were going through at the time, but with the guitar back in the forefront, sort of leading it. I kind of missed it in those previous records, but you always learn from things. So that was a nice way to cap that period, I think.
Well, the pairing came about because I loved that song "Man in a Box," and it was I said let's get these guys to open for us, and I played the video for everybody, and see what they look like. And I said, look at these guys are cool, and everybody said yeah, and that's how they came out. And Jerry Cantrell's remained a dear friend, probably the number one alumni wobble rat from the birthday bashes. I don't think he's missed one or two maybe in 30 years. So he's been a dear friend. I love him dearly, but watching those guys on stage was unbelievable. I watched them every night, and I used to tell them, they used to start with some of their deeper tracks. They had a couple, "Man in the Box," and they used to save it to the end because it was their, kind of like their 1-2 punch, their power punch.
Yeah.
And I talked them into opening with it. I said, you're fucking crazy, because they're getting flipped off. People are just flipping them off and booing them and shit. Not real bad, but really not giving them no love. The Van Halen crowd, they were pretty nasty folks, and on an opening act. And oh man, come on, the singer with
Lane Staley.
Yes, Lane would squat. He'd take his leather jacket off real calm while Jerry was soloing. He'd fold it up, like a butler, and lay it on real easy, lay it down real slow on the drum riser, and then he'd turn around, he'd squat down, like like he's taking a shit, and just take his middle finger and hold it up, just like to the audience, fuck you, just looking straight at him for like, during the whole solo, and then he'd take the mic and start singing his ass off again. I thought it was funnier than shit. He really, really had some balls, and he sang great. I mean, that band was great. But the point is that I said, open with Man in the Box, you dumb fucks. That song's a hit. They're going to say, oh, that's who these guys are. Nobody knew who they really were, and they did, and it really helped. It helped immensely.
Besides Alice in Chains, how much were you into grunge as a music fan and a musician? And did it affect Van Halen at the time?
Yeah, I think it fucked with everybody's head a little bit, because we started getting pushed aside by, the media, MTV and the media. Everyone, started looking at grunge as the next big thing. And, when you're one of the biggest bands in the world, it's like Elvis with the Beatles, I guess. You kind of going, do we embrace this or do we fucking say they suck? You know what I mean? It's like, well, most bands try to think the next thing that's putting them out of business or coming up and taking their crown, they usually dog it and think it sucks. But Eddie and I embraced it because we liked Alice in Chains so much. We became dear friends on tour. I mean, we hung out backstage, on and off stage. It was really great until Lane got messed up again at the end of the tour.
Yeah,
I remember the last show. I could tell he was stoned, and I thought, oh boy, not this again. Because I used to always say, hey, Lane, man, you want a beer or something? He'd say, I can't. I'd say, what? You can't have a beer? You can't just drink a beer or take a shot of tequila? He said, no. And I said, why? He said, because of the other stuff. And I said, oh, I didn't. I started kind of being his friend and trying to help him out, stay clean, stay cool, because I like to have a good time every now and then. So then I got it, and Jerry told me about all that, and I didn't realize it. And then later, at the end of the tour in Seattle, I saw him. It was disheartening. It just was dark. It just didn't look good. And that's the last time I saw him. But like I say, Jerry and I stay friends. But honestly, I can be straight up honest. We were kind of afraid of those bands. Like if you saw them, it was kind of intimidating. I wonder if they're going to be nice to me. You know what I mean? It's like you think, because the same thing. Most guys coming up, they shoot their heroes in the back.
Yeah.
And the guys seeing the young guys coming up, they put them down. Like, oh, what the fuck? They ain't that good. They don't know what they're doing. Hey man, they'll see. When after they've been around 10 years, that's the insecurity that people have. I not. Alice in Chains, but when I, saw the guys in Pearl Jam would come to a show, or I met all those guys, I was a little bit intimidated by them, and not as bad as the punks. When the punk scene was happening, those guys were belligerent. They fucking come and spit in your face and shit. Like, I mean, whoa, dude, have some respect. They go, that's not our gig. But the grunge guys were easy to get along with. They were great, but intimidating at first.
Inspirationally, do you think any of that worked its way into the Balance record, sound-wise?
100%, absolutely. That song, Don't Tell Me What Love Can Do, for instance, 100% about, Kurt Cobain's shooting himself. I had the lyric, you've probably heard this before, that I wanted it to be, I want to show you what love can do, because I felt that somebody could have saved him, with love. I felt like, his friends around him or somebody should have reached out and taken care of that guy. That's like what I would have done if he would have been my friend. I would have kept him around another week, or I don't know what it would have been, but that's kind of a joke. But I would have tried. And you see a guy going that far down the road. But Ed now wanted to make it darker, and don't tell me what, let me make it an attitude song. So I changed that line around. But that's about him.
Well, I think that it was natural for me to participate in it because, I come from an acoustic bass, and I think Alice did too, really. I mean, Jerry is an amazing guitar player, acoustic guitar. That's what I remember the most, is how we met on that acoustic level. And, they asked me to come in the studio, and they told me what they envisioned me singing on Brother, and it was really amazing. It was just a very unique situation.
what's so cool about that EP is it's just so like it feels so organic and just like natural. It seems like it would have been, you know, a fun few days in the studio. How well did you know them at that point by the time you went in?
I was just getting to know them.
Nice.
The way my house was situated in Seattle, it was in the middle of a kind of a big triangle of where all these guys lived. And so it was natural that after a show or something like that, my house would be a gathering point. And that's where I met them. I don't remember who I'd been to see, but everyone came back to my house, and Alice was there. And it was when Lane was still living. I remember Lane and I sitting out by the pool one night, and it was in the fall, and we sat by the pool and we just kept seeing all these shooting stars, because that's when you see them in Seattle, is in the fall. And that was my memory of Lane. And that's how it was then, because they were all just like young pups, and we were all sort of thrown together, and they were open and I was open, and it was very cool.
How did you and Nancy kind of find your way into that whole network of bands? Because it's a really interesting thing. As you know, it's like the 30th anniversary of the quote unquote grunge thing. And it's like, there were lots of, you know, bands and artists that either they had a positive view of, you know, what happened during that time, or they feel like they were negatively affected by what happened during that time. And for you too, you know, for Heart, it's like you guys were just part of that fabric, which is pretty cool. And I always kind of wondered how you two kind of found your way into that fabric of what was happening then.
Well, part of it was that Kelly Curtis, who was the manager of Pearl Jam, had come out of Heart. I mean, he had been our friend from very early days as teenagers, and then we hired him to work for Heart, and he worked his way up through the ranks and became our publicist in the early 80s. And then when he left Heart, he worked his way up through the music world and became a manager, and became the manager of Mookie Blaylock, who became Pearl Jam. So we knew Kelly, and so through Kelly we met. I guess we went to a lot of events where a lot of the Seattle music bands were playing, and then because I lived right in town, like whenever I went out to see music, they usually would come back to my house. And that's really how I met a lot of people, was just by going to see them and then hanging out later. And eventually we all became friends, and we began to trust each other. In those years, it was like, it became really popular to be a grunge, a so-called grunge act. If you were in LA and you thought of Seattle, you thought it was called grunge. Well, it never was in Seattle. They hated that term, but that's what it was called if you were from out of town. And you'd see all these record guys and attorneys and stuff coming up to Seattle to make deals with these young guys. And then at SeaTac, they would change into their plaid shirt, you know, and then come into Seattle and just give these guys record deals. And a lot of the young music scene guys in Seattle became really resentful, because they signed these deals and then it was bullshit. They went into it as innocents, and they didn't realize that they were signing into the entertainment biz, which is the exact thing that they were flipping the bird against and saying fuck you to in their music. And it came up to Seattle, changed into a plaid shirt, and consumed them, you know? So there was a lot of resentment up there. And I think that Heart, who had already been through all that in the 80s, like, I could understand. And it was that understanding that gave us a place to really communicate.
I was very depressed. You have to figure out, you know, I wasn't listening to much anyway. I was dimly aware of some of it. Yeah, I was aware of Nirvana. I love people with passion, and it's not related to how much dexterity they have on their instruments. It's what comes from the soul. And Kurt Cobain, for me, looked like a kindred spirit. I wish I'd met him. I never did. But and of course, Dave Grohl was in that band. Wow.
Yeah.
Yeah, and it was amazing. The rest of it probably less so. I mean, Alice in Chains I was aware of, but you know, I probably couldn't sing you their songs. And I remember visiting Seattle around that time and kind of drinking it in, kind of realizing that something big was happening, and in a good way. I remember getting kind of immersed in the graffiti because I'd always kind of hated graffiti up to that time because in Britain it's just mess. But I went to Seattle and saw these beautiful colored things on the walls everywhere. It's like it kind of reminded me of psychedelia in the days when I was a boy. It was cool to paint everything in fluorescent paint and whatever. And yeah, I just felt there was a great community. There's a movement going on there.
You know, there was a generational shift. I never loved the word grunge. I don't think Kurt was a big fan of it either, but you know, certainly he was a product psychologically of the 80s American version of punk rock, you know, from sort of Black Flag, Dead Kennedys, Sonic Youth, that strain of indie rock punk, you know, very much coincided with his high school years and you know, inspired him, that there was a authentic, non-polished, non-contrived lane for rock and roll, and that you know, the MTV, which was just starting when Belladonna came out, then had been around for a decade, and there were the big rock bands, you know, were called by a lot of the critics in the late 80s, early 90s, hair bands, because they were so the way they looked in the videos, and usually there was a fan off camera blowing the hair, and a lot of the guys had obviously spent time in the gym and were showing off their pecs and things like that, and it you know, it created a lot of energy for a rebellion against what people would call corporate rock and corporate rock media, because the radio stations certainly were the biggest influence on a lot of those things, a lot of what the bands and the labels did, because the radio stations were the prime curators of what the mass public could hear. So, you know, there was a pent up appetite for a new, younger wave of rock. This always happens. You know, I would say generation in music is 4 years. It's the length of high school. You know, you know, people don't want to listen to the same stuff and have the same heroes. Not only they don't want the same heroes that their parents had, they don't even want the same heroes that their older brothers or sisters had. They want their own thing. And, you know, there were some artists that were breaking through new avenues, REM in their own way, Jane's Addiction in their own way. But, you know, Kurt had this genius for songwriting and incredible singer, but he also understood the symbolism and the language of the punk culture, and he was able to fuse them in a way that, you know, changed the definition of what commercial rock and roll was almost overnight when Smells Like Teen Spirit came out, you know, as the first track on Nevermind. So I knew there was a generational, that we were part of trying to pull off a generational shift, that there was this younger audience, there was a younger media. It wasn't a mass audience. It was the people who collected 7-inch singles and who read the fanzines and who listened to the college radio stations. But that usually what's avant-garde one year becomes mass culture a few years later. You can kind of feel that something was going to break through. And fortunately for those of us that work for Nirvana was the one that then blew open the doors. And then after that, you know, kind of very quickly, Pearl Jam, Soundgarden, Soul Asylum, Alice in Chains, you know, a bunch of other bands speaking the same cultural language became big rock bands.